I think people have kind of come in. I'm Deputy Governor Paul Beaudry. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Hello, everyone. It's too bad I'm not there with you. This is a great conference, and it's always great to have all the side chat with it. So I have the pleasure today to introduce Victor Ríos-Rull, who will be presenting the John Kuszczak Memorial Lecture. So before kind of saying a bit of words about Victor, let me just say a few words about the person that we're honoring by this lecture, John Kuszczak. So John had a very impactful and very helpful career here at the bank for 20 years. He held a whole set of positions, including a research advisor in the financial and monetary department. John was very interested in both econometrics and theory and kind of really trying to look at, using all those tools to answer important policy questions for in terms of the macroeconomy. And this lecture was then put in place as a response. John sadly passed away in 2002 from cancer. And this lecture kind of represents his legacy in bringing in really great speakers, and we'll have one today in Victor, that's kind of coming in and helping us, giving us ideas and ways of thinking some of the issues that we face at the bank, and kind of in that spirit of where this this whole conference is heading. So with that, let me say a few words about Victor. I know Victor is well known among this group, but still it's always worth to kind of review some of the aspects there. So Victor is the Lawrence Klein Professor at the University of Pennsylvania. He's also director of the Penn Institute of Economic Research. One of the good things of kind of having the chance to introduce someone like this, even if I've known Victor for a long time, it always allows you to get into a few things and kind of look in some of his background. And so when I was looking at this, I kind of found there's different things he studied in course of his progression. So when he was back in Spain, he didn't only study economics when he's, as an undergraduate, he also studied sociology, and I didn't know that. I always find it interesting to see what other things people studied before doing their PhD. And I don't know how much sociology he kind of studied, but I do feel it probably had an important impact seeing the type of questions he's been interested in over time. So after studying in Spain, Victor went to the US and did his PhD at the University of Minnesota. Then he went on to a set of different positions at Carnegie Mellon, actually at the University of Minnesota. He was also at the Federal Reserve of Minneapolis before now going to the University of Pennsylvania. Now, Victor has a long list of publications, in all the top kind of journals and all that, and that's very impressive. But what I think is more impressive about Victor is it's not only a set of articles that he's produced, he's really kind of produced a legacy in the sense of a body of work that it really influences how people think about things and how people move forward. So kind of putting that a bit in perspective, if we go back, when Victor was doing his PhD and kind of starting his career, he was in that Minneapolis tradition at that point, was kind of building this whole aspect of doing optimization based kind of dynamic general equilibrium models. But back then, most of those models were very kind of representative agents. Almost all of them were very representative agent, and they were kind of emphasizing the dynamics aspect and kind of some of the stochastic, but really didn't have much in terms of heterogeneity. One of the things that Victor really brought to life was how to introduce a lot of heterogeneity, how to kind of introduce it in the models, what kind of questions we could ask, how to kind of use that for policy. And he's been very useful in that part. And that's really kind of the body, big part of the body I was talking about in terms of bringing out a legacy here and influencing the profession. When you look early on, I remember some of his work on OLG models. Like a lot of us, when you kind of go to graduate school or things, you've learned kind of how to solve two-period OLG models, but we know that type of model can't really get at the type of issues we're often interested in OLG models, which is really about the demographics. And think about it right now, demographics play a big role. Is really, if you want to take that seriously, you really have to have quite a few periods. And Victor was really key in kind of building some of those models, kind of thinking about it and using those models to address policy issues. Now, I don't know how he progressed over time, but you see different things, different questions that appear. When you do start working with OLG models, obviously you'll have a distribution of wealth and different aspects of how people are different across ages. But what we notice when we actually look at the wealth distribution is there's an aspect that's related to age, but there's a lot of diversity within any cohort. And that kind of over time, Victor went into kind of really a lot of study of trying to understand how do we explain the distribution of wealth within the economy. And turns out that's actually quite tricky. There's so much, the distribution of wealth is so unequal relative even to the distribution of income. Really have some people that hold a lot of wealth, a lot of people at the bottom that hold virtually zero, and trying to understand those, and especially those tails were particularly difficult. And a lot of Victor's work helped us understand those tails, like at the bottom, understanding some roles like certain public policies like Social Security in the US that might influence the incentives to save for people that already have low incomes, and kind of reducing some of those incentives, maybe explaining why they hold very little wealth. And at the other end, kind of aspects of superstar economics and things, and trying to understand the top end of that type of wealth distribution. Victor's also worked, kind of when you look into there, and especially if you're looking at the bottom part of the distribution, you find a lot of people that kind of fall into personal bankruptcy and, certain aspects of understanding that type of behavior. So he's done quite a bit in terms of, personal finance, household finance, credit card usage, aspects like that. And that's been very helpful for us at the bank during, especially when we think during the pandemic. We were very kind of trying to understand, what are the incentives for people to use different types of credit they might be available to them. And, he had developed those tools and really was helpful in promoting using these type of models to ask these type of questions. So all in all, I think Victor's really been a great contributor to the economic profession in general, but in particular at the work at the bank of influencing a lot of the work that's done in our HET lab of kind of thinking about heterogeneity. A lot of people have been influenced by Victor's work. And so it's a real pleasure of kind of having Victor here today. So I'll pass it over to him, and really looking forward to this lecture.
Okay. Yeah, I can start speaking. Well, thanks very much, Paul, for those excessive words. Way more than it's deserving. So, of course, I'm super honored to be here, but not only for the normal reasons. Is that in a university, name lectures normally follow the money. So there is a donor that gives the money, and we honor the donor. But John Kuszczak was not that. He was a loved fellow. I mean, of course, I didn't meet him, but he was a loved fellow. He was a mentor for many. And I understand that the memory of his life is still alive. He helped many young people. I know I'm married to one of them. So I'm super happy to be talking about in his lecture. Okay. So let's start. So what am I going to do today? I'm going to talk about some implications of interest rate changes that we do not look much into. As you well know, the standard tool to see what interest rates do are representative agent models that operate through intertemporal substitution. And any effect of wealth or income changes a very small consumption increase. That has been said this morning by some of the presenters, so you know this quite well, especially when you realize that there is a lot of wealth out there. There is about 25 times of quarterly consumption, give or take, probably more than that. So it's very hard to get consumption of essentially some form of permanent income households in a model to respond to that. And in this model, the other property of models is that you need that the response seems to be hammed, so that there are ways to deal with that through habits. But the evidence, and Edmund is here, among others have documented that, is that there are large marginal propensities to consume. And I got we got this morning. Peter also gave that. So what do we do with this? Well, that's as we all know, heterogeneous agent models within complete markets have arisen as an alternative. There's a bunch of work in here. I enjoy reading that collective effort to learn a lot. And why is that? Well, they have a lot of poor people that respond to changes in income, and they do not care that much about interest rates. So these models have changed a little bit the mechanism that they work. But really, I don't know what people tell you. Heterogeneity by itself is not enough to generate a lot of action because there is a lot of wealth out there. As I said, 40 times, 25, 30, 40 times quarterly consumption. So it's not so easy to generate a big response of consumption to changes in income. And what has happened, so Kaplan and Violante came with this brilliant idea. So they say, you may have a lot of wealth, but you cannot touch it. It's like what your mother told you. You were a kid and there's candy. You have to keep it for tomorrow. You cannot eat it today. So that models have that flavor. There's candy there, but it's beyond you. So it's going to be very costly to you. And that's why not only the poor are hand to mouth, but the rich are hand to mouth too. And then you can do a bunch of tricks, and Ruby here knows very well of how to generate some of the delayed response. Okay, so this, I'm going to say, state-of-the-art heterogeneous agent models, what do they capture? Well, without restrictions on access to assets, without the mother preventing the access to candy, they can get these effects of redistribution of wealth from lenders to borrowers, from borrowers to lenders, and when the borrowers are particularly poor, there is a net effect on consumption. They can also capture the fact that recessions hit the unskilled worse. The loss of employment is concentrated on the low ends of the income distribution. So they capture that. They capture that a little bit, the extent to which when recessions come, not only poor people do worse, but the world gets scarier. And because it's scarier, there is a further incentive to cut consumption just to bear these well-known harder times. It's scarier in the sense that the left tail gets nastier. Some people call it variance. It's skewness, but it doesn't really matter. It's just that if you are unlucky, the lack of luck is more painful. And you can do similar arguments with heterogeneity on the business side. I'm not going to say a lot about that. And once you add the restrictions on access to assets, you get much larger responses to interest rates. And overall, and they get close to this notion that indirect effects of unexpected changes in interest rates are much more important than effects through intertemporal substitution. But what exists in state-of-the-art models really do not capture is that changes in aggregate wealth. So what things that can go wrong is not only that you have your wealth stored by your mother out there, you only have change in your pocket with which to smooth consumption, is that maybe when bad things happen, wealth disappears. And this is not Katrina coming to hit town. It's not a hurricane that destroys wealth. It comes through changes in valuation of assets. And Adrian Oakley has already noticed that, but that's only pricing flows of consumption. But really, bad things happen sometimes, and there is a big loss of wealth. And this is especially important because wealth effects matter. So this is a bunch of papers that can be interpreted as talking about the marginal propensity to consume. They can be also interpreted as consumption falls more in areas where wealth vanishes. Okay, so we need, if we want to incorporate things like this, we need models where assets can change their price. Well, physical capital would not do it because the price of physical capital is 1. Well, plus the interest rate, who knows how much, that's not really very relevant. So it's not going to change very much. But the price of land does change. So we need models with land, which is a big asset that's worth a lot, and its value is going up and down. And also, sorry to tell to all the believers in the cleanness of capitalism, a good chunk of assets are not physical capital. They are rents incorporated in businesses. And these rents, the price of that does change with the interest rate and with the business opportunities. They can change in dramatic fashion. So what we need to have are models where these prices can change. And this, of course, adds an extra layer of complexity to the models because it requires finding market clearing asset prices. One thing which I don't think is right is to use what I call an oxymoron, which is an asset price shock. An asset price shock is an oxymoron because we have to understand asset price. That's not something that comes from the sky. So we need to have models where those asset prices can change. And that's what we are into it. So I'm going to try to tell you some of the things we're doing, trying to bring asset prices, those of fixed factors and especially of land, into an older generation of heterogeneous agent models that are not of the Hank variety. They do not have the monetary policy interactions that new Keynesian models have. Okay. Another thing that standard models do not do, and I think of this as a sneaky commercial inside this talk, is that productivity is thought of something that comes from heaven in the form of productivity shocks or technology innovations. Well, perhaps productivity is something that is generated by expenditures, in the sense that in neoclassical theory, we cannot explain that. What I mean by that with my finger is an empty seat. Maybe you can say the price was too high to get in here. What I want to have is when you have models where we allow for not full occupancy of the economy, then increases in expenditure will squeeze more output out of the economy through the mechanism of slightly inconveniencing customers. And that means that when you increase consumption, productivity may go up and further amplifying the channels through which this happens. So I'm going to try to bring some of that. This is an old Keynesian amplification mechanism. So that's essentially, abandons the logic of if you build it, they will come. Okay, so we are going to, in what I'm going to say today, I'm going to implement then an expenditure externality, something proposed by Dirk Kruger and co-authors. I think that is a slight way under which you increase consumption. Businesses perceive that as an increase in productivity. Why is that? Because their occupancy rate is larger. And they do not have to pay for a part of delivering those goods. Okay, so getting more in concrete, what I'm going to do is to lay out a model suitable to study business cycles. And I'm going to do that in steps. First, I'm going to pose an aggregate model economy that crucially replicates the relevant macro aggregates and inequality in all its glorious form. And in this economy, there will be shocks, and these shocks may change wealth, both the housing and business, and the value of businesses. And these changes in wealth will be able to generate large changes in behavior associated to some forms of, that will require some forms of leverage. I'll talk more in a second. And in order for these to operate, some ingredients have to be there. The obvious ingredients is to have a model where assets and houses and businesses exist with prices that we can solve for. Of course, it has to have a heterogeneity, but this is just saying nothing because this is what we're talking about. But it will have real frictions. What I mean by real frictions is that in most models where something bad happens, say you get poorer or the interest rate goes up or whatever, you want to cut consumption. Now, if you think of Katrina, what happens when your wealth disappears? You work harder and you fix it. So these models have built in that if you get poorer, you want to save and invest. But that is not easy. So what you cannot, so one fundamental ingredient for these models to have any bite is to be explicit about the fact that you cannot cut consumption and transform it into exports or investment goods. Greece could not get out of their 2009 recession by exporting their Greek coffee and their taverns. It just couldn't. It just couldn't. They cut consumption, but what they cut cannot be sold everywhere. So that's the most fundamental ingredient you have to have. The economy cannot turn on a dime. It takes time to reallocate resources. The second thing is that wages cannot fall dramatically. Because if they could, they would, and people would work themselves out of trouble, and we wouldn't have a recession. So we're going to think of sluggish wage adjustments, and we're going to measure to the best of our ability how sluggish they are, and we're going to replicate that sluggishness. The next one is this expenditure externality I told you about. And I put them in order of brightness of the colors because that's also the order of quantitative importance. Fundamental is you cannot cut consumption and export it and transform it into saving as an economy. That's the most important one. The wages cannot just fall precipitously and allow the economy to do the same. That cannot happen. And then you get some bump through this externality. And the model I'm going to lay out can be seen as a small open economy or as a regional economy. Since I'm going to look at the implications of interest rate changes, I'm going to take the position that the interest rate is exogenous and either interpretation is valuable. So there's no monetary policy or anything. The interest rate is going to be the engine of, the real interest rate is going to be engine of changes, which means that there's a lot of work to be done to make this operational. So what's the logic of this thing? Something bad happens. For example, a raise of real interest rate. That's going to show you that it's a bad thing that can happen. But another thing bad happens is that the price of your exports fall. That's also another bad thing that happens. Another bad thing that will happen is that banks stop lending. And I'll tell you why that is a problem. And there are two forms. The loan-to-value ratio can get higher or can get worse. The debt service to income can get tighter. And any of those things or all of them together will trigger recessions. And in these recessions, there will be a fall in housing prices and local business. These households, the households in this world are insufficiently diversified vis-a-vis the rest of the world to bear these asset falls. They're going to try to cut consumption through to bear this loss. This will further generate a reduction of TFP, and all those things reduce output. And the economy is too rigid to turn this cutting consumption into an expansion. So any of these things will generate a recession. And I want to build a model that can speak to the Great Recession, that I think was a great window into the things that can happen. And as I say often, we also cite an explanation of what happened. I think we need to remember there was a drop in consumption of 10% over trend. Where did that come from? So we want to have a model that can speak about that. But I also want to have the model that I'm going to put in front of you to be thought of as a financial stability view of monetary policy to the extent that monetary policy moves real interest rates, which is what I'm going to be moving. It's going to generate financial stability problems. And yes, so I don't want to say anything about that. So what we are concerned is with the asset price effect. So that's the extent which is financial stability. So financial stability is not, I'm talking about not through the eyes of the financial system, of the health of the lenders or the intermediaries. I'm going to talk about to the volatility or the changes in asset price. Okay, so what is, so now I'm gonna get even my hands dirty. So think of a standard BIHA model, the Bulim, Rohoroglu, Haggett, Ayagari, with some bells and whistles. I want to have a lot of wealth. I don't want to cheat by having everybody up to here by assumption. So I want to replicate the amount of wealth out there, but I'm going to be explicit that a good chunk of it is in the form of a fixed supply, both land and a fixed factor of production. Then wealth is going to be very concentrated as it is in the data. And I'm going to generate wealth concentration in two ways. Shocks to earnings, that's a standard shock in all one of them, in all the models up there. But also I'm going to generate we're going to generate wealth inequality by posing shocks to capital gains and losses in locally owned businesses, which is a fixed factor in production. And through these means, it's very easy to generate the wealth inequality that we observe. I like to think of the shocks to shares of local businesses as a form of shocks to earnings, because somebody opens a business, gets a huge capital gain, they don't have a high rate of return. They have like unrealized labor earnings that are delayed, and they only show up in the data with a delay and blind to most data collecting agencies. Blind, certainly, to the Social Security Administration, that Fatih will talk tomorrow, and underrepresented to the tax authorities in the form of capital gains carefully managed and often not realized because the business never changes hands. Okay, then in this model, of course, there are incomplete markets due to financial frictions of the form of loan to value and interest rate to income. I'm gonna limit the ability to trade on business property, but that's not very important, and sluggish wages. Then I'm going to speak at the end about insufficient evaluation, which is an interesting property. Okay? So I'm going to give you some details of the environment. One, I cannot live without one equation, without two slides with equations. Then I'm going to try to tell you how to look at the US or to Canada or to whatever country that you like through the eyes of this model and tell you that this looks like an economy on average times. And then I'm going to show you impulse responses, which is I have the economy, I'll get a big hammer, and I'm going to bang it through an increase of interest rates. I'm going to see what happens to this economy over subsequent years. I'm going to do it 4 times. First, a real interest rate hike, then a perfect storm. What is a perfect storm here? Interest rate high, worsening of access to financial markets, and a small fall in foreign demand for exports. And I'll tell you at the end that this is very bad things happen, but I'm going to argue that this is not a perfect storm. This is a small storm relative to what could happen. Then I spend a minute talking about what happens when we get rid of the externality in productivity and what happens when the valuations are not big enough, they are partial. Okay, so now with the model, there's 3 types of agents: households, producers of non-tradables, and producers of exports. 3 intermediate goods: non-tradables, exports, and exports are just exported, they're not used domestically, and imports. And consumption is a composite of non-tradables and imports. Investment in business capital is another composite of exports and of non-tradables and imports. Houses are another composite of tradables and imports. These composites differ. Consumption is much more intensive in non-tradable. Investment in business capital is more intensive in imports, but it doesn't matter that much. What matters is the Lasieux substitution. And as I said, the final goods may have different ratios. And housing will be a combo of structures and land. Structures can be produced, but land is in fixed supply. Okay? So I don't want to make all land so that I exaggerate the effects of the shocks. So these households hold wealth, which are liquid, houses, shares of local firms. And let me tell you the problem of the question. The questions are simple, just households do the best they can to consume and save. That's all they care. They have those things are shocked up there, and A are liquid, are total assets, and they care about a composite of consumption. A consumption is a composite of these two goods and housing service. And they have a budget constraint that says, these houses are very convenient. You can buy and sell a closet every period. You can change how much housing you have. Okay, so you can spend it in the two goods, imports, and in a foreign liquid bond. So it's always this liquid asset that you can hold your wealth in, and then you allocate resources to those things, and you have wealth or labor income or shares of the businesses. This is the key equation here. Your wealth tomorrow is whatever you saved in the form of a liquid bond plus the value of the house tomorrow. Don't be intimidated about the details in here. This is just about record keeping of the composition of the value of the house and the structures. The key thing to understand here is, imagine the price of the houses change. In particular, imagine the price of the houses drops. Then your wealth drops dramatically. But if you have a huge mortgage, that would not change. So if this economy is populated by very leveraged households, anything that reduces the value of wealth will be a dramatic reduction of their assets because their liabilities will not be touched. So if you own 20% of a house, and that house goes down in value by 10%, then your wealth goes down by half. And that's what we want to capture. Then if you want, it's not that there is not a lot of wealth, but it's that the leverage will induce many, many households to have enormous losses. Maybe. Then there are the financial constraints that you cannot borrow so much. Okay, so that's it. That's the problem of these households. The things that I want you to worry is that to solve this model, we're going to solve this model and everything, but we have to worry about the prices of these goods, have to clear in equilibrium the price of non-tradables and the price of houses. Okay, then there's a bunch of non-tradable firms. Let's not worry about them. The key thing to worry is that they are adjustment costs. That it's not easy for these firms to turn on a dime and adjust their capital stock or their workforce cheaply. And we're going to play with those things to take care of the behavior of investment. So whenever I hit the economy, if you're in a normal model, what will happen is consumption drops and investment goes up the roof. Because you just take the stuff you don't want to consume, you make it into capital. That we don't let it happen. So we're going to make adjustment costs big enough so that investment moves a little bit more than consumption. So this is a theory about consumption mostly. Okay. That's it. So that's all the equations. So the export sector is similar to non-tradables. Now, another important thing is that why would housing prices fall? Well, some people, if the user cost of owning a house is related to the interest rate, so owners of houses, when they see the interest rate higher, they have too much house, so they want to sell it. If that were the case, that's the case. If the natural thing with most utility functions, the rich people will buy it. The rich people, all these houses that poor people don't want, the rich people will buy them. So we're going to make sure that they won't. Well, why not? Because they have no use for them. Rich people don't want to live in poor Philadelphia neighborhoods, that's for sure. They don't want to live in middle-class Philadelphia neighborhoods. So the way we're going to make sure is to give some nonlinear angle curves for housing. So the rich people will not be absorbing a lot of the houses that come to be sold when poor people get into trouble, poor and middle-class people. Okay? One thing about to tell you in these models is that houses are too cheap. What do I mean by that? The existence of financial constraints makes people incapable of bidding as much as they would like for the houses that are very valuable to them. So when financial constraints change, when other things change, make these people that want to get as much house as they want no longer be willing to bid for them. And that allows for the value of those houses to drop, as we saw in the Great Recession. Okay. The labor market is just people. Workers are inelastic, they want to work, and the limits and the wages are determined by some form of excess demand. Okay, but job creation, which is important, is what is endogenous here, and the number of vacancies. Okay. There's nothing interesting in the production sector. Untradable goods are frictionless, but there is an externality in TFP. Okay. Key thing is adjustment costs have to be there so the economy doesn't move. Okay, so now we are ready to map this model to data. Okay, so this is the model, nothing all that weird. So let's think of a period as a quarter. I'm going to make business owners perfectly correlated with earnings just because I'm lazy. I also want poor people. Now, this is important. How do you get poor people in worlds like this? Well, here, wealth is very valuable. It allows you to have a house. So if you live forever, you will get around to save it until you have enough to get the house that you want. So that cannot be possible. So there are two ways of making people unable, or three ways to make people unable to hold a lot of wealth. One is to call them stupid and to have them being just poor because. Another one, which I'm more and more sympathetic to, is that poor people have very poor mechanisms to save safely. When I'm saying safely, I mean not to fear from inflation or to fear from firms, is to fear from their relatives or their friends. That makes it hard to hold assets. But in here, I'll do it the old-fashioned way. I'll kill people. When you kill people, you renew them with newborns, and newborns do not have time to accumulate wealth. So it's a bunch of young people that start the economy without assets. So they want to save and to get some kind of housing in the way. I'm going to start this economy with zero international indebtedness. So you could imagine things will get a lot worse if the net foreign asset position of this society was much larger. And the key parameters I want you to concentrate are the elasticity of substitution, which are the ones that are going to matter. The first one is the wage one. So we're going to say wage will go up by half the percentage that output does. That's We've estimated this in the data is about 0.6, so we put 0.5. The next one is the TFP elasticity with externality, which is 0.5. That 0.3 is a mistake, which means if expenditures go up by 1%, TFP goes up by 0.5%. Now, if you look at the data, traditionally, the orders of magnitude is that 1 by 1. So output goes up 1, productivity goes up 1, and labor goes up 1. Traditionally, this was thought of technology shocks. Now, I don't know you, but I've never seen any technology shock, except for the last 6 months of the problem with the supply chain. But before that, I never heard of any. I never heard of anybody who has seen any. Never seen a paper that documents that they are. So productivity is going to be procyclical here because it tracks expenditures. So when consumers fill the restaurant owner will be very happy, but the fellas of Statistics Canada or the BEA in the US will impute that to productivity change. Well, no, the restaurant was full. So the cost per meal is a lot lower. So that's I said, is 0.5. The next one was the elasticity substitution between non-tradables and imports is 0.8. I think I heard this morning a paper, it was Corsetti and your old colleague, Sylvain, I think was supposed to go through there. And they documented that things are not so easy to substitute with imports. So 0.8 is in the conservative side. So the more inelastic, the more trouble. So this is in their spirit, but very conservative assessment. And let's not worry about adjustment cost, because that's just, as I said, it's only to trigger the right relative respect of consumption and investment. Okay. The moments I want you to see is that in yearly terms, capital is worth 2 GDPs. Houses, 1.8 GDPs. That's about the orders of magnitude of around 2007. I don't know, I think in Canada, we probably may be a little bit less than 1.8, but I don't think a lot less than that. Zero debt to GDP in the sense of zero net foreign asset position. Of course, many, many households have enormous debt, but the country as a whole does not. Wealth to output is 4.5. Well, that's about 25 times quarterly consumption. So 2 times 1.8 is 3.8. So what is this? That's the rent of businesses. That's a fixed factor. That's a part of the business holdings that can go up and down. That's the recipe of Coca-Cola. That's the monopoly right that Visa has. That's the monopoly right that Facebook used to have. Okay, but that's the kind of thing that is there. It's not that it's reproducible and its prices go up and down. The US in all its glorious inequality, 0.82 on Gini. So that's what we want is a modern economy works like, it looks like this, okay? I don't want to bore you with the other details, but the one I want to tell you is this one. These are the Lorentz curves implied by the model, and the data are quite similar. Look at this. Most of the wealth is held by the very rich, okay? And you can see that the bottom 80% have 20% of the wealth, give or take. But that's not true in households. In housing wealth. Housing wealth is a lot more equally distributed. This version of the model, even the poor have a closet but it doesn't really matter the bottom 20, 30%. The key thing is households rank between 30 and 85 have a net negative asset position. Financial negative asset position, which means when the housing or the stock market falls, their wealth falls by much more because of the financial debt that they have. Okay, so now we are ready to use the hammer. So again, just to remind you, I'm going to increase the world interest rate by 1%. I'm going to call that baseline. To the extent that central bank is capable of doing that, is 100 basis points on the real. Let's say that they could do that. Then the not so perfect storm, which is 1% baseline, tightening of the loan to value, and a mild reduction of the price of exports. Then I'll tell you what happens if we get rid of the externality in TFP. And I'll put the price stickiness on the non-tradables, which is a form of insufficient evaluation. Okay, so just to remind you, the elasticity with respect to expenditure is 0.5, the wages 0.5, the import substitution 0.5. Okay, this is the shocks. The interest rate, 1%. It's persistent but temporary. So it eventually dies. This is measured in quarters. Price of exports constant, loan to value constant. So this is the exogenous part. Okay, the first one. What does that do to land prices? 4.5%. Remember, this is just, what about housing prices? Well, 4%, partially because land is the main ingredient of the price of houses. What about the valuation? It gets evaluated 3%. So here, the imports become more expensive, and the non-tradables become much cheaper. That's what clears the market of non-tradables. Total wealth goes down by 4%. The businesses also suffer. Remember, they suffer enough so that even though capital doesn't get destroyed, the reduction in the value of, in the overall value of businesses is of the same structure, the same size as that of houses. And this economy starts saving across the rest of the world. And they start having a 2.5% trade surplus immediately, and it goes up to 5%. So this economy really tightens its belt to the extent that that's possible. International will try to do that. So this, like Ludwig was talking about, one small country in the world, these are some of the same flavor. If the world lets you do it, that's what you would do. Okay. What happens to output? Well, 1.5% drops immediately. And depends on, like, all these international models, there's all the subtleties about which price index you have when you have the valuation and the like. So this is the numeraire is the US dollars, I mean the imports, but about 1.5% drop in output. Unemployment goes up 1.5%, and it's quite persistent overall. This 8 is just because we think of unemployment creating all the people that go in and out of the labor force. So that's what we get it. Now, the net exports, you see that they take a big jump up, and eventually, when you save enough, well, eventually, those extra savings will disappear because the economy will goes back to a steady state eventually. And as I promised, that this is an economy that hits the unskilled worse. So this is the poor guys who work in construction, and these are the lawyers. That nothing will, or the economic professor. Things are not so bad for us. Okay. One thing this economy can do is cut its imports dramatically. That's what happens. This is what our trade colleagues do. When a country gets into real trouble, in 91, Korea or whatever, or the UK, I cannot keep track of when that happens. Exports don't move, but imports disappear. We take that to be that imports are very easy to adjust, but exports are not. You need a foreign distribution network. You need to do all kinds of investments to increase them. So this economy replicates the ease with which the adjustment happens through decreases in imports. And consumption falls between 2 and 4%. Remember, output was 1.5 in the orange color, which is the color that uses Bessier prices, the ones that are used in the the type of price indices that we normally use. And investment in this case goes a little bit more. Remember, this is due to the adjustment cost. The economy cannot take all the extra consumption and build export capacity overnight. Why is that? Because it's not very easy. It's going to take some time. And as a result, the increase in export, which is really what this country likes to do, export itself out of trouble, barely goes up by a little bit, mostly through the devaluation at the beginning. And then it's able to generate some extra export, but by the time it can do more, it no longer wants it because it has accumulated enough assets and the worst is over. Okay, so this is the exports in quantity units. Okay. Just want to say, TFP, remember TFP would move about half of the drop in output. And there is a GDP deflate that goes down. That's just another way of talking about the devaluation. Okay, let me briefly, let's look at a longer view. Before I was looking 10 years, I'm going to look at 80 years. Price of structures recover fast, but the price of land is going to linger a long time. We don't know exactly what's doing this, just it takes a long time for these households to keep enough assets to bid up again for the value of houses that they had. Okay? And what I showed you before was up to here. Remember the 40 years, and I said this is a long view, so even 40 years later, we are clearly below the long run. Same thing about wealth doesn't recover completely. And unemployment takes its sweet time to go all back down. So things do not recover fast. So what are the takeaways? Sizable recession with large drop of wealth, drop of consumption, large reduction in employment, large devaluation. But large improvements in balance of payments because of through the reduction of imports mostly. And exports can have a brief moment of glory, but as I said, by the time it has time to adjust, the opportunities go down. And this, we confirm the findings of Mark Aguirre and Gopinath that says, they're talking about the cycle is a trend or something, made a case that things last for a long time, where we confirm that in here. So let me put a perfect storm, which I'm going to claim, this looks to me, when I want to make the case that the Great Recession was sort of like this. I'm going to have a 3% temporary but persistent decrease in the terms of trade, which is not that much. A reduction in the maximum LTB from 80 to 60, and the externality, when I keep it, 0.5, and the rest of the things are there. So I'm going to add these two shocks that happen simultaneously. Small reduction in the loan to value. This is just paperwork, remember. This is just paper, nothing real. And this is just the foreigners are not willing to buy as much as before. Okay, so this is just the exogenous shocks. And they go back relatively at the same speed as the interest rate, they go back to steady state. Houses go down 15, 17%. In the Great Recession, they went down 20, 25. Remember that. So this is the type of disaster that can happen. The country devaluates about 5%. Now the business losses are not as large, but still the means area wealth is about 8%. So this is still quite large. And this country, to the extent that it can, because of the rest of the world is not moving, it's having 8% trade surplus. So this country is able to do something about it. How do they do it? By devaluating and cutting imports. The falling output is about 5%. Remember, this was just 3% loss in the price of exports, 100 basis points on the real interest rate. And this paperwork changed on the willingness, on the ability to borrow by households. And employment goes up 4 percentage points, and net exports skyrocket to 5%. And this goes, how does this happen? This happens again by a colossal drop in imports. And you have consumption dropping 10% below trend. This is what happens in the Great Recession. That type of movements was this big. Remember, there's no productivity shock, nothing like that happening. All I'm doing is increasing the interest rate and saying you cannot borrow as much as before. The result of that is this colossal drop in housing prices. Everybody is jumping to cut consumption to keep affording the houses that they did. And the economy gets into some colossal funk. Okay, they can export, so the imports fall, and they can export some out of trouble. So the main takeaway is here that everything's larger. And you can see how big this is. But remember, the adjustment happened through cut of imports and a small surge of exports. But clearly, we all know, not only from what Ludwig said this morning, that cannot happen for the world as a whole. The world cannot export its way out of trouble. There's nobody around to buy it. So that's the kind of thing that the next wave of people will have to say, well, what if we're all there? If we're all in the same boat, what happens then? Okay? And this is not consistent worldwide. One of the things we're exploring, it's not done yet, is to have a drop in foreign demand so that you cannot export more. Okay? And then what? Okay. If you have no amplification of the expended externality, how much time? I have 3 or 4 minutes. I don't want to overdo it. Let me finish fast. If you have this externality in productivity is not there, things have the same flavor. This is just the baseline again, and they're a little bit smaller. And if you have an insufficient evaluation, things are smaller, but they get worse longer. So that's the only message I want to give you. I can give the details to anybody that wants. So let me say this is the baseline. So if you have a partial devaluation, which is about half, you can see this is in the long horizon. Things last a lot longer. By 10, 15 years, things are still going bad with the partial devaluation, which has taken a long time to catch up. Okay, then employment also is a lot longer. Okay, so in the space of output, the baseline was 1.5, perfect storm 4.5. The no externality takes some time to show it, but it's about 1.25. And insufficient evaluation is about half, but for much longer than the baseline. Okay, and unemployment has the same flavor. Okay, so what we want to do that we haven't done yet? Well, some things are technical. It's like make financial restrictions only on the newborn. And the key thing is build this into a world economy so that we are all in the same boat. And there we have to think of interest rates being endogenous and see to the extent that can be manipulated by or chosen by monetary authorities, which means that we have to build a modern Euclidean structure on top of this to be able to talk about the kind of things that interest most of you, that we're not in a position to say anything yet. So let me summarize what I've done. So the unit agent models have come a long way to become useful tools, and we've seen blossoming. And why do they do that? Because they have more mechanisms than just this Euler equation tilting a little bit, which is really not a lot of action there. And they incorporate some wealth and redistribution effects, but we need to have not only wealth, not only to have very little accessible wealth, but to accommodate the wealth losses that we've seen, because the Great Recession told us that those things can happen. So, conclusion about policy. We need to develop models of monetary policy that are those beyond the tools that we have now. I'm saying there This is another commercial. I see that there are large returns to further investment. That's to go one step ahead of the models that we have and include asset prices and their change. I want to say that financial stability is a concern, not only as through the financial system being weak, and I have nothing to say about that, but through asset prices themselves. And because they affect directly households. And as we were talking this morning, this is more true in Europe than in the US, where where mortgages are indexed, and they will have a cut in net income when interest rates go up. So one thing I haven't said is that these shocks, the effects are not symmetric. If you lower interest rates, housing prices go up, but the party is small. Why is that the capital gains that households get from asset prices are not going to be spent overnight. So these permanent income households will increase their consumption, but slowly. However, when you go down, households see the edge there and they jump backward. So this is not a shock that has both, that is symmetric both ways. So you can cut interest rates, you don't see much. But when you tighten, but this model says bad things can happen, okay? And I'm done, hopefully under budget and under time.
Well, I was looking forward to your talk, Victor, and I can say I wasn't disappointed. As I, hinted, how much you brought in, the heterogeneity was really shown here, and I think this is a really great example of how we can move forward and try to bring in more of these features. Certainly these aspects of wealth effects, I think, are really important, especially as we've moved from very, very low interest rates where wealth effects could be kind of extremely enormous to kind of higher rates. We're really changing a lot of that, and it's a question of how long all these effects will last and things. So we'll open up to questions. Since I can't see people in the room, I'll let Yaz kind of control the questions. And again, here, I want to thank you, Victor, for just a great talk. Thank you.
Well, I cannot say the same. Your introduction was too exaggerated to be great. But thanks anyway, Paul.
Thank you, Paul.
Thanks. Looking forward to seeing you soon, Victor.
So I'll manage the Q&A session from here. I think we're a bit over time, but we have time for a few questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand in the room as well as in the virtual space. No? Okay. Oh, please.
Okay, so then let me take the bit outside of the model. Because when you're looking, so in our paper, what we're also documenting is that there are very large idiosyncratic shocks to households in terms of their house value, right? So as a household, I don't invest in a housing portfolio. I invest in one house, and that suffers a lot of, idiosyncratic noise. But when you look here at these shocks in the housing value, this is again on the aggregate, or do you have some sort of cross-sectional differences? And what would be the role of these potential cross-sectional differences in households in like the marginal, in all the effects that you have?
Okay, let me be a politician here and answer a different but related question. This is a model where the house market is a chunk of land. You can buy and sell every piece of it. As such, households have no shocks there. They have shocks to the share of businesses that they own. And we can put them there. We can add them to the amount of housing that they have. But we have no intelligent thing to say about the extent to which that is affected by the other things happening in the economy. That's why we haven't put them. On the other hand, one of the things we know is that housing prices both are very volatile amount, and they underestimate the actual volatility of the housing market in the following sense. If the market is hot, housing time to sell is about a week. As those of you that tried, I think, Tiff, you were trying to buy a house a couple of years ago, weren't it? That was a hot market. It was not easy. Okay. However, when things are bad, it takes about 6 months to sell a house. That says that the actual mess of the housing market is much worse. So the idiosyncratic part is that when you want to sell and in a bad time, it's very hard for you to find the kind of customer that falls in love with your house and is willing to pay what will be allow you to move out. So I would say that to try to answer as close as what you wanted, is that I would love to increase the model into having a frictional housing market with such frictions, and Aaron Hedlund has shown us how to do that. That's very costly, where when bad things happen, it effectively becomes, as the idiosyncratic variance goes higher, in the form of larger time to sell. So you're most dependent on somebody falling in love with the house and willing to pay the extra amount. So in a way, we see a lot less. So the turnover is about 1 order of magnitude more volatile than housing price. And all of you that if you ever want to sell a house, turnover is an important it's an important consideration as you worry about how long are you going to live in the wrong house. So in that sense, we want to get models like that and make sure that we allow things to get as bad as we see them. That's...
John, please.
I only offer this because it's triggered to a degree off of your question, but I'm trying to combine the sort of wealth destruction you described and shock with a heterogeneity that's sort of aggregate, but sort of not. And by that I mean I'm combining climate crisis. And there are going to be people in the world with an expanding population, but people living in a world where there's going to be reduced arable land, that in a sense there's going to be a shortage of land and housing. You're going to have massive immigration, or migration rather, triggered, but you're going to have a group of people who happily find themselves in a part of the world where you don't have to accommodate or adjust as much. And you're going to have large parts of the world which are going to find the value of their wealth and land suddenly destroyed, or maybe not so suddenly, but persistently destroyed. And you're going to have this tremendous asymmetry between where value is going to be increasing versus where value is going to be destroyed. And it's just a different sort of application of heterogeneity, but on a grander scale, as it were, where you have different parts moving. It just occurred to me, it's not as though you're hit with a shock where everyone in a country, even if you just took a single country, would be similarly affected. But with climate change, you're going to have potentially large parts, say the United States, which are going to be grievously affected, and others not so much, and experiencing tremendous increase in wealth potentially in the capital, land, resources they enjoy. I realize I'm just mouthing off, but it occurred to me that there was sort of a form of heterogeneity that's becoming very relevant, and I'm trying to describe, but where you're going to have, through scarcity, and enormous imbalances being created, and how those pieces fall. It strikes me trying to tie this into climate models, global climate models, in a heterogeneous context like this. I guess that's what's underway in many cases.
So let me agree half, disagree half. So the agreement is that the name of this project, if you look at my computer, the directory where this stuff is in, is called Gold Rush. And what I mean Gold Rush is that this was designed to study the rise and fall of local communities. So you find silver, everything goes well, capital gains for everybody, the town gets full. You lose silver, or you get a wave that comes over, you get the same thing in reverse. So this is partly designed to accommodate changes in fate that in this model take the form of the price of exports. You think of the price of export that this country has, that this is the only thing they can use to pay for the imports that they need. If that thing vanishes or shrinks dramatically, we have a version of this model in the works where people live. Now, eventually, if we will have to have a multi-country version of that, we will have to worry about the kind of things that you are worried about, which is Bangladesh getting empty with 150 million people that will be in trouble. That's the part I agree that I think we're thinking of that. There's some papers, my co-author and friend Per Crusell and his buddies, they're writing very modular multi-region country worlds with squares of 25, I don't know, a few thousand squares in the world and see how they interact because the climate is very local and the damage is very local. And so there's work on that. I'm a little bit less apocalyptic than you are. That's a part of disagreeing about the size of these things. When these guys want to measure that, just to give you their sense is that the optimal carbon tax is on the order of $60, $70 per coal of carbon, and that's actually below the current tax in Sweden. Now, that's a cheap shot because in Sweden they're taxing something that they don't use. So it's a very easy tax to enforce, but it's not a colossal thing. And the other one is that some of us economists think elasticities are bigger than others. And for that one, I think I'm more optimistic than you. As the sea raises, Miami will move backwards. Now, how much would be that? We'll see, but I'm a little bit more optimistic than you are about this whole thing. But yes, but to make a long story short, yes, but we think with use of these models in this form of migration, as I said, gold rush for these issues. And there are people who are wondering about the differential fate of climate change of different parts of the world and how can population and the costs associated to their movement will follow.
I apologize for my wandering observations, maybe fueled by too much dessert at lunch. But anyway, I really enjoyed your presentation. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Given the overtime, let us conclude the John Kuszczak lecture here. Thank you very much, Victor, for the inspiring presentation. Thank you.
Thanks to you for your kindness.